Today is a special speaker series event. I do say it a lot, but we have 4 times the horsepower that we usually have under the hood. We have 3 expert panelists and 1 expert moderator who are here to help us kick off our department-wide and week-long charrette starting on Monday. USU LAEP has partnered with the USU Institute of Land, Water, and Air, the Nature Conservancy, the Basin Water Conservancy District, the Great Salt Lake Advisory Council, and several other institutions to explore and envision strategies to address the shrinking Great Salt Lake. I have the privilege to introduce our moderator, Brian Steed. He has earned both his undergraduate and graduate degrees in political science at USU. He earned a PhD in public policy with an emphasis in environmental policy from Indiana University, Bloomington, and a JD from the S.J. Quinney College of Law at University of Utah with a certificate in natural resources and environmental law. He's taught economics at the John M. Huntsman School of Business here on campus. Spent several years in Washington, D.C., serving as Chief of Staff to Utah Congressman Chris Stewart, then as Deputy Director of Programs and Policy at the Bureau of Land Management. Steed returned to Utah in 2019 to head the Utah Department of Natural Resources. He left Governor Spencer Cox's cabinet in 2021 after accepting the role as the first executive director of the Janet Quinney Lawson Institute for Land, Water, and Air, where he works closely with the USU President, President Cockett, as an advisory group of leaders in state, county, and city government. His wide-ranging experience in political science, economics, DC politics, and environment and resource management gives him a unique view of our charrette topic and makes him a perfect moderator for today's discussion. Please welcome Brian Steed.
All right. Thank you so much, Sam, for the kind introduction. I'm going to stay seated if that's okay, because this is, after all, a panel discussion. Wanted to say how grateful we are as panelists to see this many people participating. It's always a bit of uncertainty when you have a panel at 3 p.m. or 3:30 p.m. on a Friday afternoon on who exactly is going to participate. And so I'm really grateful to see so many people here, especially so many young people, to talk about this topic that's become really important for the entirety of the state of Utah. I am joined here on this panel with a series of, well, I'm going to call them my friends. We've all worked together for a lot of years on a variety of different topics, but there are no 3 people in the world that I'd love to be sharing information about the Great Salt Lake more than the people that are sitting to my right. I'm going to go through brief introductions rather than read their lengthy bios, which would take some time. What I'm going to do instead is just introduce them in their official titles and ask them to introduce themselves. I'm going to start at the far right. We have Laura Briefer, who is the Director of Salt Lake City Public Utilities, or Department of Public Utilities, position she's done for how many years now? A few years. 6 years.
7 years, almost 7, yeah.
A personal anecdote, Laura is scary smart on water policy and water law, and was awesome to work with when I was at the Department of Natural Resources. So Laura, do you want to?
Thanks, Brian. Can you all hear me okay? It's great to be here. This is actually my 3rd time coming to talk to students at Utah State University. I love when I get invitations to come up here because it's so amazing and beautiful, and you all are amazing too. So I am, as Brian said, the Director of the Public Utilities Department for Salt Lake City. That means I work for a city, and so when we're talking about Great Salt Lake, I am carrying a perspective of local government and the ways in which local government interact with the Great Salt Lake and the environment. I have about 28 years of experience in environmental work, starting when I was a park ranger during college through environmental consulting. I led a nonprofit organization on environmental issues and ended up in municipal government. My undergraduate degree is environmental studies. My graduate degree is public administration from the University of Utah for public administration, University of California at Santa Barbara for environmental studies. And I'm returning back to the University of Utah as an adjunct professor, adjunct instructor this year, teaching ethics in public administration. So I greatly value this higher education and the amount of critical thinking that goes on and learning that goes on in this institution and in this in the academic setting. I think I'll just end there because we have a lot of questions, and I'll turn it over to
Awesome.
Tim. Yes.
So next we'll introduce Tim Hawks. I'm accustomed to calling him Representative Tim Hawks, although he no longer is. It's a sign. Maybe you should be again. I don't know. But he's no longer representative. This is the first legislative session that he's stepped away from that, and that's why you seem so relaxed and happy. Tim currently serves as general counsel for the Great Salt Lake Brine Shrimp Cooperative. But let me brag on Tim a little. When I worked at the Department of Natural Resources, the Great Salt Lake became something that everyone in the state started to talk about. Tim had led that conversation for many, many years before people even knew it was a problem. In jest, I started to refer to Tim as the Lorax of the lake when we were in committee. And there is no one that really has put more time and effort into the policy side of the Great Salt Lake from a public service perspective. So please welcome Tim Hawks.
Thanks, Brian. Thanks, everybody. I really appreciate it. It's great to see everybody. I see Wayne Wurtzbaugh in the back there. Wayne's done a lot of great work on Great Salt Lake over the years. And let me just say, I'm a little bit of an accidental convert to this cause, if you will. I did my undergraduate work in political science at BYU. I went to law school at Columbia, and I wound up at a big law firm in Washington, D.C., one of the largest law firms in the world, working on terrific things with super smart people, and I was utterly miserable. I reached a point where this was not what I wanted to do with my life, and so I did a total Green Acres thing. I said, what interests and animates me, and it was the environment, and so I went to work for Trout Unlimited here in the state of Utah, and I didn't know anything about water law and policy or anything else, but I was kind of their policy guy. 2004 came back here and just started naively advocating for water for the environment. And I did that for a number of years. I ran for the legislature, was elected to the legislature. And what's interesting about our part-time legislature is if you know anything about anything, you become that expert. You're the sort of the subject matter expert. And so it was really rewarding in the legislature because I quickly became the water guy. And then things eventually Trout Unlimited, kicked me out. And the brine shrimp picked me up. So my daughter says I'm moving down the food chain. I went from fish to fish food. I guess algae's next. But honestly, until I took the job with Trout Unlimited, I had no idea the value of Great Salt Lake. I really didn't. And I figured water that made it out to the main body of the lake was just salt water that was kind of wasted. What's it good for? But it's been a really interesting evolution for me to learn just how valuable the lake is, to engage in this policy space with some terrific actors, really. It is probably the most interesting and exciting and compelling and challenging policy space I can imagine anywhere, and it's been very, very rewarding to work with so many bright people on a really, really tough issue.
Thanks, Tim. Next, it's my pleasure to introduce Marcelle Shoop. Marcelle is the director of the Saline Lakes Program for the National Audubon Society. So more than just the Great Salt Lake, but all over the nation. Marcelle has a very unique background, having worked for industry for a time, but also then taking that knowledge she gained working for industry and taking it into the NGO space and working as a very, very effective advocate for the Great Salt Lake and all things, all things wildlife related really in Utah, but especially with a focus on wetlands. And so please join me in welcoming Marcelle Shoop. Marcelle.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay? All right. It's so awesome to see so many people here. We didn't know what to expect, so this is wonderful. And I would just say, Brian said it, that I came from industry and actually fell into part of my second career with the National Audubon Society that is focused on birds in the places they need. And in particular, the Saline Lakes Program was started about 5 years ago, really focused on this idea that we have these terminal saline lake ecosystems throughout the West, all of which are really at risk. And maybe whoever's doing it, is it up?
Yep.
Okay, yes. Because our organization focuses mostly on birds, in many respects, or at least it seems that way, that is a primary focus. But we know that what's important for birds includes things that are important for people, and one of those is water, and how much water, when, and where. And so when we think about Great Salt Lake, it is one of the key spots for this network of saline lakes across the West that support millions of migratory birds. But also, all of these lakes are really important at a local level, and so we spend a lot of our time on Great Salt Lake, and it's a fascinating opportunity to be able to bring wildlife and conservation in with the water policy space. It's pretty exciting. And with that, some of our work has really focused on, how do we bring more water to Great Salt Lake? And so we work with partners like the Nature Conservancy and have done water transactions on the lake and have now just implemented or started the Great Salt Lake Watershed Enhancement Trust. And so I'm acting part-time as the executive director there. And
You want to explain what that is a little bit?
yeah, I can do that.
Yeah,
but I
that'd
was
be
just going to say, Tim and Laura and I and Brian all get to work together on some really amazing policy work that drives solutions. And so I'll be anxious to hear what comes out of the Charrettes, because we're going to need a lot of solutions to address the challenges facing Great Salt Lake, and not one of them can act alone. They need to be working together. So I'm excited about that. What would you like me to say about the trust?
Just what's the origin of it? What is it?
So the Great Salt Lake Watershed Enhancement Trust is I'll call it an entity, but it's just formalizing its existence right now. The legislature last year put aside $40 million to help with retaining and enhancing flows for Great Salt Lake and restoring and protecting wetlands that have a hydrologic benefit. And I have to thank legislators like Representative Hawks and Speaker Wilson for really making that happen. And so that entity, or the trust, is just getting off the ground, and we'll have an advisory council soon as the state appoints that, and we'll be continuing to work on really important issues for Great Salt Lake. But again, it's just one of the many solutions out there that are needed.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And it's no exaggeration to say that trust would not have come to be but for the work of the people sitting here. And so thanks to all of you for that effort. I know that we have a huge topic area that we could potentially cover. I also know that the Great Salt Lake is something that's interesting. When I go places, I often have a lot of people in the room that are brand new to the lake that are interested in it, and I also have people in the room that complain. And I'm calling it Great Salt Lake fatigue, saying they've heard so much about it, they're done. So I'm going to start with a question first. So let me ask you this, and I'm going to start with Tim, but the other panelists, if you can chime in. Why do you think the Great Salt Lake has captured so much public attention? And is it overblown, or is it underreported? What are your thoughts?
Not overblown. I'm going to start with why people don't care about Great Salt Lake. So I represent the brine shrimp industry. Joanna Enterwada, some of you may know, a professor up here, does say, she recently did a survey to think, what do people care about? Like, why do they care about the lake? And you know what ranked dead last? Brine shrimp. So it doesn't help to lead with brine shrimp, but I think it's not underblown. This is such a critical issue to us. And one of the issues, one of the ways that I do talk about the lake to get people to care is to remind them all the different ways that the lake touches us. So it touches the air we breathe. And most people don't realize that. Our air quality is tied to that Great Salt Lake. Where other terminal lake systems have been lost, it's generated some of the worst dust pollution and health impacts in that area and sometimes in that region. So the air we breathe, the water we drink, we're finding out that the Great Salt Lake is really tied to our water cycle through lake effect snow. It helps moderate temperature, things like that. And the very food that we eat. Brine shrimp, yeah, they're kind of weird little sea monkeys, but they actually it's about 45 million tons of seafood production around the world is supported by brine shrimp that come off of Great Salt Lake. My company exports to over 50 different countries all around the world. So if you like to eat shrimp at a restaurant or you buy it at Costco, chances are that shrimp ate brine shrimp when it was really, really small. Magnesium from the Great Salt Lake is found in our cell phones, our laptops. Titanium is in there, and it's a very, very rich source of lithium. So it's probably going to play an important role in our clean energy future. So people don't realize it, but all of that is very much at risk unless the state can find a way to solve an incredibly difficult problem, which is to reverse this trajectory of sustained declines.
Awesome. Thanks so much. Laura, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I'll just add from the perspective of a municipal water manager. When I joined the Salt Lake City Department of Public Utilities 14 years ago, almost 15 years ago, I remember sitting in meetings where people would actually say, well, that water just runs to waste to Great Salt Lake. And, I have this training in environmental studies and kind of this ecosystem perspective. I'm like, no, that water stays in the Jordan River and gets into the environment. I've been really pleased that there's been this great turnaround in the level of knowledge. People are becoming more knowledgeable about the importance of having water in the environment, and Great Salt Lake has helped with that engagement quite a bit. And I think Great Salt Lake, if there's a silver lining to Great Salt Lake right now, it's that we have so many more people engaged in water issues and in the aspect of the environment being part and parcel of our ability to thrive and to prosper. The environmental quality is existential to us, and Great Salt Lake has really shown us that in very bold ways. I wish it wasn't so bold, but I think that's one other benefit to this issue with Great Salt Lake.
Awesome. Marcelle, thoughts?
Well, I think Laura and Tim have said it both. There may be in some parts fatigue, but I think unless we have this recognition of how important the lake is, both locally and more nationally and regionally, and if this lake actually were to decline even further to the point where we saw more catastrophic effects than we've already seen, we'll hear more and more about the lake. So it's super important. More than 10 million migratory birds use Great Salt Lake every year. And for some species, with eared grebe, that's anywhere from 50 to 90% of the North American population of eared grebe. So you have species and biodiversity that could really be affected if Great Salt Lake cannot continue to provide the habitat that is needed for these species.
Marcelle, can I ask a follow-up on that? So a lot of people have this perception that, well, water, Laura mentioned it, Tim mentioned it, when water reaches the lake, it's lost water, right? Because it's gone into this saline body and whatever else. So my question is this: what are the ecosystem benefits of having a vibrant lake?
Well, I think for somebody who lives and breathes, environmental issues, having biodiversity is critical to actually humankind's survival, from my perspective. And with Great Salt Lake, you have a number of different types of wetland habitats around the shorelands, anywhere from playa to mudflats to really deep water that sometimes are impounded wetlands, and then you have other areas that are open water. So you have a lot of variety, and for certain species, that the ability to have either that saline or brine-ish water with fresh water coming in creates a lot of food sources. And if you look at that network of saline lakes that I mentioned earlier, if you think of those lakes as a whole, for some of these species, it's irreplaceable. You're not going to find, you're not going to be able to recreate habitats of this size and quality that easily.
So one of the things I hear is when people mention eared grebes or any other species is, why don't they just go someplace else? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, they do go someplace else at different times of the year. Eared grebes, actually, there's about 4,000 pairs that breed at Great Salt Lake, but many breed elsewhere. But they travel back through on their return to their winter grounds further south. And at that time of year, there aren't that many options. There's Great Salt Lake. Mono Lake is another one, but they've seen reductions at Mono Lake and still trying to understand that. And so you have eared grebe that come here. They're so dependent on the south arm of Great Salt Lake and the brine shrimp there in the fall because they come, they molt their breeding plumage, and they're very vulnerable until they regain their weight and regain their feathers and can fly away. So it's not like you can, we don't know where else they could go at this point.
Got it. Thanks.
I think, Brian, if I could
yeah,
just add,
please.
too. One thing interesting about the eared grebes is when they leave, and at some appointed night, they have some signal, some internal signal. They all leave at once at night, and it's so many leave at once that it shows up on radar. It looks like a storm has just suddenly magically appeared on the south side of the Great Salt Lake. You can see it on radar.
And if you don't know what an eared grebe is, I certainly didn't before I started at DNR. Look it up. They're cool birds. So it's a waterfowl, and they are pretty cool. Laura, let me ask you a question. How does Utah's growing population affect the lake? And at what point does growth enter the conversation?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I get that question a lot from our constituents and other stakeholders. And Utah's population is growing really fast. The Wasatch Front's population is growing very fast. All of this population is coming into the watershed that provides water to Great Salt Lake. And it's coming in as residential population, high density housing. It's coming in as manufacturing and industrial uses. All of them have a water footprint. And I think that, one of the things that we've all been working on for some time right now is to work on better integrating the water planning and population and land use planning and integrate those more so they don't happen in silos. Oftentimes you have, state laws and county or city laws and rules that govern land use and how we grow. And then you've got a whole other set of legal frameworks that govern how we manage our water. And that's kind of set up this disconnect. And I think now we're starting to better connect those and really looking at what does smart growth mean in a very arid area with some very significant environmental challenges. And just as an example, with respect to Salt Lake City, we're starting to look at ways in which we have changed portions of our land use ordinance over the last 2 or 3 years to better reflect that integration of land and water planning and decision making. One key element is changing our landscape ordinances on what's required for people to put in their landscape, since much of our water is used outdoors in the summertime. In the municipal and industrial, yeah.
So give me an example of that. What does that look like?
So that looks like there are some requirements and some incentives. So that would look like removing non-functional turf. It would look like requiring a certain amount of the landscape to have plants that are drought tolerant. But there's other things too, like changing the ordinance that basically puts a cap on very large water users coming into the system. We've recently had a major land use change where we have an inland port in an undeveloped area of our city. We're getting a lot of interest from different types of industrial users, some of which use 2 to 3 million gallons per day, which is an extraordinarily high amount. Tesoro Oil Refinery is on our system, uses less water than that. This was bottling facilities and others. And so the city said, we want to grow smart. Those types of industry, while they may have a lot of value, may not be the way we want to grow in terms of the types of jobs and economy we want, given that we're in a water-stressed area. So we have a cap now of 200,000 gallons per day, which is still a lot of water use, but it's something that we can better plan within the constraints that we have.
Thank you so much. Tim, do you want to riff on that as well? You just got out of the legislature. You heard a lot of people caring loudly about a lot of things. What are your thoughts on growth?
Well, I think the challenge is, growth does, it's not so much growth per se that's the problem, it's that how we grow matters, right? That's Envision Utah's kind of slogan, but there's a lot of truth to it. I mean, it's interesting when you think about it from a water supply standpoint. If you take a home that doesn't have any outside watering on it, imagine a cabin in the woods that's on a well. From a water supply standpoint, that is no net loss of water. Because people are using water in the cabin, but where's the water going? Back into the ground, right? If they're on a septic system or whatever. But it's not really lost to the environment. It's available for other uses. Maybe it's going to be cleaned up, but it's available for other uses. When we talk about if we continue to build with people on half-acre lots and a lot of outdoor grass that they're not using, non-functional turf, well, something's got to give, right? Either the ecosystem's going to give, or ag is going to give, or something's got to give. You can't do all those things at once. So I think it's key. I think the challenge from a policy standpoint is, what are you going to tell people? Don't move here. You're going to tell people they can't move here. You tell people not to have kids. You're not going to do that as a policymaker. And so the challenge is, how do you create incentives that actually encourage the right behavior?
Yeah.
Got it. Thank you so much. Marcelle, do you want to add anything on growth?
I think you've said it well, and I'm really excited about the efforts that are being made by the state to really push and incentivize integrating water and land use planning, and I think that is something we've got to do. It's going to be harder in the retrofit context, and so hopefully we'll see a lot more incentives and programs that really help people make the change in the M&I context.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Tim, let me ask you a question, a little different. We've been talking about really urban growth. Let's talk about agriculture. Agriculture is often viewed as, well, we've had a lot of press. We've seen a lot of press where agriculture is pointed as a culprit, right? So let me ask you this. Is it fair to blame ag? Is it fair to talk about ag's participation?
Yes, it is. I tell my friends at the Farm Bureau, this is your fault. It's your problem. The thing about a tough policy question like this is it's always easy to solve it on somebody else's back. And typically when I hear that, it's used as an excuse to not do something, right? They'll say, well, why should I conserve? Why should I use less, turf if ag is diverting so much water? And that really obscures some really more complicated questions. If right now the number that's typically used is about 80% of the water in the state of Utah goes to ag, and about 20% is M&I. But that obscures some really kind of interesting things.
What is M&I? Sorry.
Oh, sorry. Municipal, sort of for homes and businesses and industries. That's sort of the M&I component. But what's interesting is if you look at the Great Salt Lake over its history, if you went back 100 years, it would have been more like 95.5 or 97.3. Like almost all the water was going to agriculture, and the Great Salt Lake was actually in a pretty good place. So what's changed? Well, some things. Some more heat in the system is one, but also the way we've grown and developed has changed as well, and that creates something what we call like a hardening of demand. So ag's use of water is seasonal. If you have it in homes and businesses, it's not so seasonal. You need water all the time. And so the reality is it's a shared resource and it's a shared responsibility. And there's no solution for Great Salt Lake that doesn't involve agriculture, but that doesn't involve all the rest of us as well. Right. And it's really important for people to realize that and ask the question, what can I do to help? Because that's where our solutions lie.
Thanks so much. Let me ask Laura a question. Landscape architects and environmental planners are accustomed to scenario planning. Are there alternate scenarios that should be posed to the general public or legislature regarding Great Salt Lake? What do you think?
Yeah, I think scenario planning is a really important tool, and you're probably learning this in your studies, but it's a really important tool for us to compare what are our options. What adventure are we, I don't know, do you guys ever read those choose your own adventure books?
Yeah.
What adventure are we choosing, and what are the unintended consequences? What are the intended consequences? It's like a policy problem. You wouldn't solve a policy problem without looking at scenarios and alternatives. on a very local scale, scenario planning is being done all the time. So when I prepare my water supply and demand plans out to the year 2070, I'm looking at, okay, in scenario 1, we have land use looks like this, population growth looks like this, and our water supplies look like this, and they might look less because of climate change, and our water conservation goals are going to look like this. And so we're always kind of balancing what those different futures might look like. And I think it's really informative. And it's also really important to be transparent to the public in that scenario planning so they can see the different things that you're weighing, the different decisions that you're weighing, the pros and cons. And Brine, if it's okay, I also wanted to just, on the agriculture question.
No, I didn't add that. Yeah, of course. Sorry, go ahead.
I mean, this is my perspective in sitting in state level and even national level discussions and policy arenas on water. But I don't think it's very helpful when we start getting into this conversation of like, well, it's all this party's fault. Because I think as Tim mentioned, there's a lot of history, a lot of socioeconomic decisions that were made in the past, a lot of culture surrounding agriculture in Utah or in other Western states. And it's not helpful to problem solving if in the conversation you are dismissing the other party, because it is a collective action. We all have to work together, and we all have to buy into the solutions together. And as a representative for Salt Lake City, I know that I've been in these meetings where I get met with, some kind of bias because I'm from a city, that the agricultural community says, "You're from Salt Lake City. You don't know what I'm talking about." And right then and there, it's like, oh, we have some work to do in terms of bridging gaps. And I think that relational aspect in this conversation is crucially important.
Thanks. Marcelle.
Let me to add something on ag.
Would you please? That'd be awesome. I would love it if you'd address the ag question, Marcelle.
Yeah. Well, the fact of the matter is I grew up on a farm. But I also think that some of the important conversation with agriculture is really thinking about, there's a lot of effort right now around agricultural water optimization, which is great, assuming that any saved water actually can be used for the environment, or at least doesn't get consumed elsewhere. But I think one thing to keep in mind too is there are important areas around Great Salt Lake where some people might not view the way they're watering their crops as optimal or whatever, because it's flood or it's just regular irrigation. But there's a lot of opportunity for return flow, and there's been some USGS groundwater modeling and other things that have really shown the importance of some of those areas in like the Lower Bear River. And if those areas become urbanized, that interchange of water between the farms and the lake could disappear. And so unless we have a way of actually really understanding the implications of that, there are lots of reasons to make sure that we're working with agriculture in a way that actually can help find solutions. And then just more broadly, not just the Great Salt Lake, there are a lot of places where agriculture, depending on what crop and the approach to their growing, provide a lot of surrogate habitat. And so I think it's good not to forget about that and to formulate that into our thinking as well.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Really important points. I'm glad
Thanks.
you said something. Can I ask one other question though regarding kind of ecosystem stuff? So if we put efforts into saving the Great Salt Lake, what other aspects of land, water, air will that impact in Utah? What are your thoughts?
We were talking about this earlier, and I'm going to throw out some stuff, and I think Laura and Tim had some things to say too. But okay. I guess I would one of the things I would add is there are a lot of things that policy-wise that are being done to address the issues at Great Salt Lake that have other benefits. So, for example, in the integrated Great Salt Lake Watershed Assessment Program, one of the things that effort is looking at is water supply and demand across the whole Great Salt Lake watershed, 33,000 square miles. I mean, very large. And some of the things they're looking at are how much water do we need, for people and agriculture, but also for the environment. And so looking at a way, bringing the environment into part of the equation for the water budget for Great Salt Lake watershed is a really important factor. And then the policy around land and water planning, I mean, that really stemmed from discussions and policy recommendations about some things to do to address Great Salt Lake, and I think that's huge. So I'm happy to.
Tim, thoughts?
Yeah, just briefly, I think I say to people, and without exaggeration, that the eyes of the world are on us to see whether we can solve a very tough problem. Around the world, these terminal lake systems, the history has not been positive, so they typically crater. And then everybody's worried about trying to just mitigate some of the harms. They can't really restore the lake once it's been lost. So it's interesting that in the last 6 months, I've given 2 presentations to sections of the United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization, the FAO, on just this issue, because I was in Indonesia last month, and a shrimp hatchery manager in Indonesia said to me, "Are we going to have a Great Salt Lake?" So, that really is, so it's not just, even here just regionally, some of the solutions that we're looking to implement here on Great Salt Lake have implications not just for Utah, but for the United States and even for the world.
Awesome. Laura, thoughts?
I think just underscoring what these two have said, that, I mean, really the solutions and the approaches that are being taken do serve as a model for other large-scale and complicated environmental problems.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I'm going to ask a question of the audience just real quick, and then I have one more question for the panel, and then it's Q&A. How many of you are participating in the Charrette? It's a sizable number. I should have started this way, but I'll say thank you so much. Mm-hmm. I saw the schedule, and yikes. Seems like a lot, so thank you so much. But I just want to emphasize that what you do is actually important, because none of us here have the solution. And going back to Laura's point on collective action, it's really going to take all of us to figure this out. And there is not a one-size-fits-all solution. So it's important. So let me ask you, I'll say the final question. Maybe I'll reserve the right to ask another. But the final question, so, I mean, I'll just go back to the beginning. If we have Great Salt Lake fatigue and, tired of hearing about it, well, is there an option of just doing nothing? Will it fix itself?
No.
Laura, go.
I mean, yes, you could do nothing, and I think we could look back and, if you study environmental history, look back at times when we have done nothing and it's caused a lot of harm, and and when we have done things, we've turned things around. Like I go back to the formation of the Clean Water Act after we had all kinds of water-related, water quality disasters, Love Canal, those types of things. So I think, doing nothing would really probably harm our community and our environment quite a bit.
See? It's a sign from above.
I'll stop there.
There's no clear signal. Tim?
I just say, I think, listen, a lot of the values that really make Utah a place to live and that have made it such a dynamic economy.
That takes a long time. I got to be honest.
Yeah. but to think about it, people. That's kind of cool. One of the reasons that people want to move here is because of the quality of life. And and one of the things that people are most worried about, if you ask them, it's about their air quality and about the opportunities for their kids. And the reality is that much of the population of Utah lives along the Wasatch Front, and if you go to a narrative about bad air and toxic dust-laden air, which we've seen the press really sort of embrace some of those narratives, that's a big deal. That could really change what's been an incredible dynamic economy very, very quickly. So I think what's interesting in scenario planning, so I've been involved in some business planning lately. One of the most interesting scenarios that you can run is, what's the worst case scenario? Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then what would we do? And what's happening, what's playing out in the media right now in Great Salt Lake is the worst case scenario.
Yeah.
Lake's going to be gone in 5 years. Okay, I'm not sure that's accurate from a scientific standpoint, but what is it driving? Attention, and ultimately people trying to figure out, well, what on earth are we going to do? How are we going to address this issue?
Let me ask you a question on a follow-up. I mean, give me examples of other terminal lakes. I've heard your presentation on this a bunch of times. Give me examples.
Yeah. So the biggest is the Aral Sea, which is in Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and it was the 6th largest lake by surface area in the world. The Soviet Union diverted its water supply because they wanted to grow cotton to be more self-sufficient. And the lake in 30 years lost 95% of its volume. And so it just became a giant dust bowl, and you saw really high rates of respiratory illness and death. The local economy collapsed. Salt going on to ag lands, all kinds of problems came about as a result of that, and they haven't been able to address that. Lake Urmia in Iran is almost a perfect mirror for Great Salt Lake, and Professor Wurzbach has some great presentations on that. But Urmia has gone past that, I hate to say point of no return, but really crossed some of those critical thresholds. But then it's easy to write that stuff off, Iran, Uzbekistan, blah, blah, blah. Look at Owens Lake in California. It's maybe an 18th the size of Great Salt Lake, much, much smaller. And yet when Los Angeles diverted the water from Owens Lake to supply water to Los Angeles, that little dust bowl became the largest source of particulate dust pollution in North America. And Los Angeles water payers, water users, have now spent almost, $3.5 billion?
I think more than that now.
Pushing $4 billion, not to bring the lake back, just to mitigate the dust. Mm-hmm. And so that shows us that even close to home, if you don't do anything, what you wind up doing is spending an enormous amount of money just to try to mitigate some of the harms.
Yeah. Marcelle, what's the cost of doing nothing?
Well, I almost think it's what they were saying, which is no action means you're just going to end up having to take. There will be actions that follow, and consequences, and so it's not like doing nothing solves a problem. And if we don't know exactly what the future will hold, but I think what we do know is we don't want it to be the catastrophic future. And so, what do we need to do now, and what can we continue to put in place for the long term? Because we're looking at trying to look at short-term solutions, but also some of those solutions are about changing the dynamic long term. Yeah. So I didn't answer your question directly, but
that was a good answer,
I gave
though.
my answer.
I'll go with it.
Okay.
Brian, can I just add?
Please.
Just another piece of that is doing nothing will lead to a tremendous and unnecessary public cost, whether it's financial cost, whether it's public health cost, all of those intertwined. Doing nothing really will hit us hard in terms of all of those costs.
Awesome. Not awesome. That's not the right word.
But
Let's just say thank you for saying that.
It does mean there's some urgency, right? That we're trying to get things done. So.
Good. Okay, so now we have saved some time at the end for questions from the audience. That's you all. And I think that I get the microphone too.
I have to take your mic too.
That's
the mic fell off.
great. So I'm going to surrender the microphone.
Do you want to borrow mine?
No, it's okay. It's all good. And so you won't hear from me again. Thanks.
Now you don't want what's in his wallet.
Any questions from students? Yeah. Just hold it up.
When we were talking about the agricultural question, I was reading one of Utah State's recent articles about it, and they had a line in there that said, "The end user of agricultural water use is you." Mm-hmm. And that was the first time it hit home for me. It's easy to point fingers, but I don't think we realize, well, they're growing the food for us. We're the ones using that water, albeit indirectly. And I remember, pardon my ignorance here, but I remember learning once in like 7th grade, I think it takes 50 gallons of water, 200 gallons of water per pound of beef. And I never hear people talking about that as a way to, I hear people say, don't water your lawn, but I never hear anyone say, don't eat meat on Monday, like we did in World War II. So I wonder if that kind of solution, does that kind of topic ever, or that kind of topic ever addressed in policy discussion or anything?
Great, you hand that microphone back to me. Yeah, I think that there is some conversations about that. I can say that based on Utah and our demographics of where much of our water is used for food for agricultural production, whether that's dairy or beef cattle, I think that you would find there'd be a lot of resistance to that approach. But I'm not even a panelist. I don't know what I'm asking. Tim, answer the question. What do you think?
No, I think it's a great question because it's thinking outside the box, right? And I mean, I have a couple reactions. One is, I think when I look at the low-hanging fruit on the lake, what is it? Well, we know that has value. Like you said, we use it, right? I mean, and it also feeds economic value. The grass that we don't use doesn't do that. And I don't mean the grass that kids play on. I'm talking about all the grass that's out there and park strips and in front of businesses and churches and schools that people don't use. It's just there because it's cheap and it's easy. That's the true waste, right? But I do think some of these conversations make a lot of sense. I mean, what's driving deforestation in the Amazon? Arguably a demand for beef, right? This really high quality. It's one of the reasons I find the aquaculture sector so interesting, because there's some real arguments you can make about sustainability. But we do have to think about that, right? I mean, we grow a lot of alfalfa here, and we grow it because there's demand. And why is there demand? Because we like hamburgers, right? And I'm not saying you shouldn't eat it because, listen, there are great sustainability stories on all of these fronts. Beef can be sustainable if it's done right, but it's probably not an everyday meal, right? I mean, not if you want to be sustainable about it. So I think we talk about it at the margins, but ultimately consumers drive these things, right? So it is looking ourselves in the mirror in some sense.
Thanks for a great panel. I've learned a lot from all of you. I was wondering if you could just talk about some of the proposed partial solutions. Is this Great Salt Lake Trust going to be paying farmers to fallow land? Or is there going to be I've heard rumblings and experiments with water banking. Is there going to be some conversion from water-intensive crops to water-less intensive crops, even though it doesn't provide hamburgers or alfalfa? Because it just sounds like there's going to be some really hard choices to make, and I'm wondering if the policies that you're thinking about, are they going to be mainly economically motivated with economic incentives, or are you thinking really holistically about diverse values that could motivate people to undertake overcome this tremendous collective action problem?
I think Marcelle should address the trust, but that policy issue. But one of the things that we all participated on over the last few years had to do with HCR, House Concurrent Resolution 10, where a group of stakeholders, which was your resolution, right, getting water to Great Salt Lake, where we established a lot of stakeholders to work together to find solutions for both municipal and industrial, agriculture, on public engagement, on regulation. And so I think there is a sensibility of more of that holistic view of, there are so many different types of tools in the toolbox. Not one single solution is going to solve the problem. We're going to need to pick and choose our tools for the different parts of the system that tool would work for. So, from my perspective, we are looking holistically. We are engaging with stakeholders across the board.
Marcelle.
Yeah, thanks. That was a really amazing, thoughtful question, and a really hard one, I think, to answer, in the sense of how can we do all of that, and do that right away. I think it's going to take time for things to shift and adjust, and maybe that's where some of the scenario planning comes in, to understand what the ramifications of those kinds of things are. The Water Trust is, just getting kicked off, but it has some, a nice bunch of funding from the state, but water is expensive. So the goals will be to try to, retain and enhance flows as best the trust can, but hopefully there'll be other opportunities for bringing more funding and growing that. With respect to the trust working with agriculture, we really hope that there are some really good opportunities for that, and finding the right ag producers that want to work with us to make sure that whatever they're doing can actually work to try to use their saved water to get to Great Salt Lake. Those are all fairly complex issues, but we're definitely working on it. And I also think there's, and maybe Brine, you're going to talk about this, or Tim, about some other policy or funding that the state's working on to actually do a short-term, large-scale fallowing process for this year, next year's.
Not it. Tim, do you want to get it? What? I said not it. Go ahead.
Well, Director Joel Ferry, who makes his living in agriculture, had sort of talked about using demand management, which is really something that was defined in the Colorado as sort of an emergency lever we could do here in the Great Salt Lake. Last summer, we hit salinity levels that put that ecosystem right on the brink. And so there's only a couple things you can do: shrink the size of the lake, the size of the bowl, or put more water in it. So how can we get the water? And so there's some discussions about putting money out there to say, hey, could you get by with 20% less? Could you get by with 30% less? Totally voluntary. If you want to do it, then the money will be there to do it. It's not a long-term thing. We're not trying to do what's called buy and dry strategy. That's where I buy the land and the water rights and strip the water rights off. No discussion of that. But temporarily, there's been some discussion. And to this question of economics, I think it's interesting because there are people out there that think the only answer, the single thing that will solve the lake is just to increase the cost of water. It's artificially cheap. We got to increase the cost. There's probably some truth to that, but it's not the only thing. And one of the things I look at that's the most empowering is secondary metering, which the state's invested heavily in, $250 million. We're not changing the price of anybody's water. But what the science shows is that when you simply give people information, they'll tend to make more responsible decisions. That's a powerful idea, and that's broader than just pure economics.
And that's, we're talking on maybe 30% less water use, and that's in the M&I sector. I would also just say from policy levers, you'll see a lot of conversation on ag optimization. What ag optimization is you go in and retrofit existing ag operations to have devices that use less water. You can, on a pivot system, you all know the pivots that go around and around and water. If you just lower the level of that, there may be some water savings. There's different on flood irrigation. If you do pulse irrigation in certain areas, there's a significant savings. And if you were to say to the average farmer, you can grow the same amount of crops for and save 15% of the water, that's a lot easier to sell than coming in and saying, well, gosh, you're just going to have to stop doing what you do for a living. Yeah. And so that's one of those policy levers I think the state's going to be pursuing quite a lot. I've heard like $200 million potentially in a bucket for that, in addition to other large investments around the state on agriculture, just to make sure that there's less water used.
Just a quick question. So we know that there's different components to this, but we also know there's a lot of people out there, and I'm not one of them necessarily, because I understand the climate's changing. But what do you do? What's your guys' response to people who keep saying, "Oh, we're just in a drought. This will go away"?
Honestly, I haven't heard that many people say that to me, but that is a really good question. The science shows that the climate is changing. We have a lot of the data. We have snowpack data around that. But there is sort of an ethic around water, our relationship to water too. And it's not just about this current mega drought. It's also about how we look at water a little differently, and we think about what the value of water to the environment itself. It feels to me, and maybe my field of vision in terms of the constituents that reach out to me is, very Wasatch Front centered, but it feels to me that ethic has really grown in a really good way, where the question is more, how can we help you make good decisions about how we manage water, rather than arguing that it's not necessary to do because the lake is going to just bounce back up after this drought.
And I'll chime in. To your point, I mean, when I was at Department of Natural Resources, I heard that quite frequently. Just because there's a lot of people that, you know, and there are cyclical natures in climate, right? There are wet periods and dry periods. And so there is this, I mean, there's noise in the system. And a lot of people latch onto that noise to say, see, here's proof. If you take the longer term, graphs, just in looking at them, we're seeing three trends. Right? Trend number one, we're seeing warmer temperatures, and those warmer temperatures generally mean you'll have higher evaporation off the lake. Secondly, we're seeing warmer temperatures during the periods of time that people care about rain and snowfall, particularly from January to March. If you look at those areas, you see higher temperatures during that time frame, which means that you're actually getting sometimes less snow and more rain. That rain is not as beneficial to our water systems as the snow is, because much of our catchment areas have been set up for snowfall and capturing spring runoff. So we are seeing those changes, and even though people will often point to say, yeah, there's ups and downs, my take-home message to you all would be, yeah, if you took, I mean, I've worked with a guy at the University of Utah, Paul Brooks, who can show that there's probably a 13-year cycle on the lake. This will be published at some point, right, where you have wet and dry periods. That being said, when you look at the lake over time, you do see this, wet and dry periods, but it's on a downward slant. And that probably best case because of things that we're doing with the water.
And let me say, Wayne's research shows that we've lost, 11, 12 feet, basically, is anthropogenic. What's interesting to me about that is if you took that 11 to 12 feet and you put it on the lake that it's at right now, it'd be right close to its historic average. So one of the ways to look at it is that we've taken the natural resilience of this very resilient ecosystem and we've taken away the safety cushion. And so regardless of cause, right, the reality is if we care about that ecosystem and the dire things that would happen if it's lost, then we have to take steps to try to build that back. Right? That's incumbent on us.
Thank you.
Good question.
Tim, you made the statement that it's not population growth per se that's the problem, but I'd like you to address that, or the panel to address that more. I would say that population growth for the last 170 years in the state has kind of got us into a lot of the problem where we are now. And if you project out the population to the end of the century, we'll have around 8 to 10 million people in the state. The Bear River Water Development Project that was funded several years ago was funded on the basis of increasing population. Yet the state and municipalities are giving tax incentives to try and get industry, along with their people, to move here to increase our population. We give tax incentives for people to have more children. And so we seem to be actively trying to increase the population, and I think the population is the root of the problem. And so could all of you address that to some extent?
Laura, go first.
Okay. A few things were kind of, I'm trying to form a response. It's a really hard question. And I'll look just on Salt Lake City's water system, where we've tracked water use over the years. Our population has grown, but our overall water use has decreased by almost 30% over the last 23 years. So is there a carrying capacity in our system? I think that's a hard question to answer, and it's intertwined with so many social policy issues, and I'll say politics as well. But I think it's really important for us to continue to be able to measure and monitor, what is the impact of the growing population and changing land uses on our environment, and not just in water use, but things like water quality and the health of our environment. I mean, I look at this all the time too with respect to the Central Wasatch Mountains, which are important watersheds for us and are in danger of overuse due to increasing population. So in my mind, we have to be really sensitive to the impacts that growing population has on these systems.
And Wayne, I just say to my point about how we grow matters, one of the interesting things is that the Bear River Project, original projections said that it would be needed by 2017, which is now 5 years in the rearview mirror. And at one point, the need for that project was pushed out past the 50-year planning horizon. Well, what's doing that? Because we're still growing like gangbusters. It's the way we've been growing has been shifting. And so the projections that showed us just building out just so rapidly, we've actually gotten a lot denser. And that does have important implications for how much you can grow before you really start to hit some of those impacts.
Yeah, Wayne, those are, yes, as Laura said, those are really important and hard social, cultural issues because of people's personal beliefs and personal choices in part. I do think, and maybe Tim can talk to this, that in terms of the economic development incentives and what we're trying to drive in terms of what kinds of businesses come to the Utah, it would be great for the state to continue to encourage that, or to ensure that we're not incentivizing large water users, or at least understanding what the impacts of our economic development policies are. And I think there's been some work done, but I'm not close enough to it. Maybe go Ed and
I just say we've done a bad job of it. And to this point about linking things, that's one where we really, the economic development, what are they out there trying to do? Jobs, jobs, jobs. We don't care how we get them, we don't care what they look like. And what some of us have been trying to say is, hey, can you consider what water impacts are before you incentivize another data center to come here that's going to consume a bunch of water? So those conversations are starting, but we could do a lot better. And we've kind of done a sucky job in the past.
I'll just also add one thing I've been thinking about, that a sucky job?
Yeah, it's a term of art.
One thing I've also been thinking a lot about, because in recent changes to state policy, as a city, a municipal water provider, now I'm able to consider current and future water supplies for the environment, not just for people. And so I'm revising that water supply and demand plan now to say, what does it look like if we dedicate X amount of our water supplies to the natural environment, to Great Salt Lake, to our riparian areas? What does that then look like? So then we're prioritizing that, and we're looking at now, what does that mean in terms of the amount of water use that we need to be striving for just overall, and creating good policy on that. And I'm also bringing together our economic development director, our planning director, and other city leaders to really start workshopping, breaking down those silos of one arm wants economic development, one arm wants preservation, and we're not talking to each other, and try to figure out where we can have some win-win situations.
And that brings us to 7 minutes past when we said we'd be going. And I just wanted to thank our panelists once again for their willingness to share their wisdom with us. Please join me in thanking them. And to you all, I just want to say thanks for your interest. I asked a loaded question at the beginning of the panel whether or not this is an overblown issue. It's, in my estimation, not an overblown issue. It has real implications for our quality of life here in the state. So thanks for caring about it. It matters, and we're not going to solve it without your help. So go out and do good work in the Charrette for those that are participating and those that are not. Care deeply about it, and do what you will. Yes, sir.
Brian, can you announce that this coming Friday at 10:30, the Charrette is convening, and you all are certainly invited.
So this coming Friday at 10:30, the Charrette is convening, correct? And we're invited, I'm imagining, and everybody else is invited as well. So thank you so much.